attendees, I'm Brianna Charlebois, editor of Blue Line Magazine. Welcome to this session at Blue Line EXPO International on integrating police wellness and ethics. Please welcome our panelists who recently co-wrote a book called The Power Manual, a step-by-step guide to improving police officer wellness, ethics, resilience. To start, why don't we have our panelists introduce themselves?
I'm Dan Bloomberg. I'm a police psychologist out of San Diego and a professor at California School of Professional Psychology.
And I'm Mike Schlosser, and I'm a retired police officer and currently the director of the University of Illinois Police Training Institute.
Konstantinos, clinical forensic psychologist. Recently completed my postdoc appointment at Yale School of Medicine. Former officer for about 15 years, and been doing research and clinical work with law enforcement.
Perfect. So you guys are coming out with a manual called POWER, and we kind of went over the acronym a little bit earlier, Police Officer Wellness, Ethics, Resilience. So maybe just to start, we can talk about the conception of the concept and the research that you each have done, perhaps, you know, Dan's integrity research and Konstantinos's moral injury and PTSD research.
So several years ago, I conducted a study on police integrity, and what I was looking at was to see if recruits' integrity, self-reported integrity, changed from before they started a police academy to the end of the police academy. And we did 3 different classes at 3 different academies, and we found that statistically there was no significant difference between their integrity scores at the beginning and at the end. Some went up, some went down, but overall there was no statistical change. But we followed that up, and that went against some of the anecdotal qualitative data on the effect of the socialization process during the academy on recruits' integrity. We followed it up and took a look at the same results. We had the same people take the test a year after graduating from the academy. So they've been on patrol for a year. And what we found was there was a significant decline in their commitment to ethical principles. What we found was that overall, after only 1 year on the job, their integrity scores went down. So that led me to start thinking about what's going on here. That was really kind of shocking to me at some level, doing this for so long, working with officers and that just led me to starting to look at what we've coined as the moral risks of policing. And some of these risks, like ethical exhaustion or compassion fatigue, moral distress, lead to emotional and spiritual difficulties, and then other moral risks, specifically related to things like moral disengagement, make it more likely that officers will engage in misconduct. And then additionally, those 2 types of risks, those that cause emotional or spiritual distress and those that increase the likelihood of misconduct, play off each other, which can result in officers committing ethical transgressions, which are also known as moral injury. And that's where I coincidentally and fortuitously met Konstantinos at the APA convention several years ago in DC, because he was presenting his research, I was presenting my research, and what are the areas of focus just converged, and it took off from there. Before I talk about the origins of power, I'll let Konstantinos mention his work on moral injury and what he found in this area.
Perfect. Konstantinos?
Well, it's interesting. This type of research actually in compassion fatigue and moral injury started about 10, 12 years ago, when, as I was going through the literature, I realized that there was nothing about law enforcement in terms of compassion fatigue. And what we mean by compassion fatigue is this kind of sense of feeling overwhelmed and feeling this kind of sense of emotionally overwhelmed and fatigued when you literally actually support victims of crimes and you actually people who suffer, people who survive natural catastrophes, people who survive trauma. And officers actually, they are the ones who majority of the times they're the ones who respond to this kind of incidents. They are the ones who actually responded first, and then probably other social service workers appear in the scene. So this kind of ongoing systematic exposure to victims of crimes and supporting victims of crimes can actually increase this kind of what we call the compassion fatigue. And that's how I started to develop different kinds of studies, which actually started with the thousands of participants in US and Canada, and another sample of thousands of participants in Europe. And what we found and I realized was that we had some significant percentage of elevated samples of compassion fatigue in law enforcement, low levels of compassion satisfaction, which means that some of those folks did not seem to really see the value of the services they do in the community. And I'm going to explain further what that means. And the other thing was that the compassion fatigue seemed also to be related to the experience of moral injury, moral distress, and also put higher risk to officers' PTSD, as well as other kind of mental health issues. But we measure primarily PTSD and moral injury. So all those kind of things were actually interconnected. So that actually built up the foundational framework. So we started building on this kind of area of work. And I made a note about the compassion satisfaction piece because at some point last year I was in one of the ride-alongs with one of the officers in New Haven, Connecticut. So we responded to it was a domestic violence case. And there were kids actually that were involved in the scene. So the officer actually, we got into the house because we were called there. So he talks to the kids. The situation was de-escalated. Social services came. Many people responded there. So at the end, when we left, I said, you know what, you did a good job. I mean, you helped the kids. You know, I see the kids were so upset. So you talked to the kids, and they seemed to be so much calmed down, and they were engaged with you. And his response was like, it's part of the job, not a big deal. I said, no, it is a big deal. You helped, 2 kids today. That's why it's a big thing. And we're talking about compassion satisfaction, to be able to actually see the value of the services you do in the community and how much important it is as a first responder, as a law enforcement officer, support victims of crimes and people who need help and people in the community who actually need support. So all these kind of constructs are actually interrelated, and they have been backed up by research findings now. So we have a number of publications and presentations and outcomes out there who actually we have some great outcomes and how those actually constructs relate to each other.
And I think our first book came out earlier or last year, I guess. It's our power book. That's a textbook that goes through all of the science behind all of this stuff. But we also realized that the concept of power, which is that really you can't separate wellness and ethics when it comes to law enforcement, that we thought, well, we don't want to just have a textbook because who reads textbooks? So the 3 of us got together and realized that what's really missing and what's not been in the available is kind of a manual that has practical exercises and experiences of stories that Mike has offered, and really focuses on positive ways to make sure that these things don't cause a lot of disruption. It's a toolkit basically to maintain wellness, ethics, and resilience. And that's kind of the focus of the book that's coming out soon. But the general principles really of our work comes in two directions. And the first is really our commitment to help individuals in law enforcement improve their wellness in all the different domains of wellness that Mike's going to talk about in a little bit. And we highlight how important it is for individual officers to understand that relationship between their own wellness and their steadfast commitment to ethical principles. That's something that is, it's not just the responsibility of the agency, it's the responsibility of the individual to be able to say, I want to have a long, healthy life. I want to be able to enjoy my retirement. I want to avoid all of these things that the shrinks are telling us about, compassion fatigue and exhaustion and burnout and all of these kinds of things. But a second area of focus is also working with organizations to foster and maintain that culture of wellness and ethics. And we'll talk about that in a little while, but
I was going to say before, and the whole idea that actually Dan talks about wellness is that I had many times conversations with colleagues, both from the psychology perspective as well as law enforcement. And they're like, okay, we know that police officers are stressed, and you know that this job is tough. And you know that we know that officers are exposed to hundreds of potentially traumatic incidents. We know that it's like it has become a common knowledge. I mean, we keep having this kind of research over and over and over again, pretty much being repetitive about this kind of findings, right? The whole idea is what do we need to do, and how are we going to address that?
Yeah.
I recall when I was in the academy, they used to tell us, okay, make sure you don't stress out. You need to calm down and need to be mentally prepared when you go to the incident. But we didn't know how, and not physically, not tactically. You learn about all these kind of things. Mike is going to explain his global expert in this kind of issues about trainings and de-escalation. But we're talking about the mental part. Nobody teaches you, at least up to the recent years, how to mentally prepare for this kind of incidents and how to mentally prepare to actually promote wellness and to de-escalate any kind of stress or emotional reactions that you may get out of those kind of incidents. Right. So that's the whole philosophy and idea of the power, I think, that we came to the point and say, you know what? We need to come with this kind of tangible, holistic, synthetic kind of perspective on how to do it, how to help people guide, like Dan said, step by step, to promote wellness or to actually de-escalate or to slow down and calm down these kind of reactions they have. So that's another thing. Easy to say, but the actions actually need to be very tangible.
Right.
Yeah. And Konstantinos, when you brought me into this project, I was super excited. And this is something that is so exciting for me because I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm a cop. I train, police officers. I've taught wellness on my department. I've taught wellness with recruit officers. And we have all of these, different things like compassion fatigue and all of this. And it's like, so that's great. But now we've actually created something that is hands-on to first be proactive so that you can remain healthy, physically, spiritually, emotionally throughout your entire career. And, there was a big need for it, but it was always kind of like, well, how do I do that? And there are so many awesome ideas within this book. And obviously you're not going to start on chapter 1 and do every single thing throughout the entire book. I think that needs to be said, but you will find things within each area that we're talking about that it's like, yeah, this is something that will work for me. This is something that I can do to help myself, physically and emotionally. So, being on kind of more the cop side, it's like, yeah, let's get together. Let's do something to help our police officers, especially in the time we're in now, right? And especially here in the United States where, we have social unrest, we have COVID, we have, a lack of trust of police officers. And so, what can we do, and including what can we do to gain that trust? So there's so much within this within this manual that I think will be helpful. And reading it as a cop, it's like, hey, I can read this and I can understand that. Not that I can't understand your guys' brilliant work too, right? It is, I love to read the scholarly stuff, but this is like, hey man, I'm a street cop and this is cool stuff. And these are things that I can do. And so that's what brought me into it. And that's why I'm excited about it. And I think it's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. It sounds like a really, really interesting book that will be both interesting for researchers and police officers. So maybe to start, we can sort of break down these domains of wellness that you guys discuss within the book. Do you want to maybe take that one, Mike?
Yeah, I can kind of start on that and others can join in. But, we know that, I know officers, just for example, that are like, I never miss a workout. I work out all the time. Or the officers that say, I eat healthy. This is my thing. Or officers that say, I spiritually and emotionally, I'm great because I have these breathing exercises and mindfulness and things that I do. And, others that say, I feel like socially I'm doing pretty good because I have, a life outside of police work and I'm doing all these other positive things. And that's great. But to be able to take, your physical health, cognitive, emotional, social, spiritual, and we're talking about, of course, with the physical, like nutrition and sleep and learning the importance of that. And how can we accomplish those things? And how can we have this more holistic approach? And so each chapter is kind of broken down into, things that you can do on duty, things that you can do off duty in order to get benefits from all of the areas that we're talking about.
And it's that, what Mike just said is so important because very often we get into a rut, not just cops, all of us. And so we tend to kind of perpetuate, get on a kind of a routine, and that can take us out of balance. And so what Mike just mentioned in terms of all of the domains of the physical, the cognitive, the emotional, the social, and the spiritual, for wellness sake, to be the best, healthiest person you can be, you need to be focusing on all of the areas. You can't over focus on one. I used to hear from cops all the time that said, I go to the gym and that's where I hang out with my friends. It's social. I'm getting my workout in. It is when I'm in that zone, I get those endorphins. That's my spirituality. It's all your eggs are in one basket. And I look at them and I say, what happens if you turn an ankle on a foot pursuit and you're laid up and you can't do what you normally do? Now, you're missing out on everything because you haven't developed, wellness strategies in the other domains. They were all focused on your workout. So we really kind of try to emphasize the importance of looking at wellness in a very broad way, and making sure that people are doing their self-assessment to make sure that they are healthy in all the different areas.
Right. Is there anything else you want to add, Konstantinos, on the
I was
domain?
going to say the other important piece is that it's not just the number of pages of theorizing, which theories are important and they actually come up with brilliant ideas and they can definitely inspire us. But at this point, we literally have practical strategies that actually teach and guide the readers on how to promote this kind of, how to apply those kind of strategies on a step-by-step kind of perspective. And not only that, we also incorporate, like Mike said, actual real police stories. Our main character is Officer Mike, to honor actually Mike here. And the officer or whoever reader is going to read and go through the story, they're going to say, you know what? Yeah, I remember I had a similar experience like that and I don't know what to do with this. So they go through Officer Mike's story and then they read through the strategy so they get an idea of a hands-on perspective on what do I need to do, let's say from a cognitive perspective, way of thinking, how am I going to change my way of thinking as a way to promote wellness? It's easy to say, oh, don't get stressed. Don't get it. That's okay. Like I said, I have one of my patients. He was actually exposed. He's a sergeant. He was exposed to a massive kind of type of trauma with types of different loss. And he was like, you know what? Okay, you'll get rid of it. And I say, you know what? It's like you have two of your legs broken, and it's like I tell you, you know what? Don't worry. Keep running in the marathon. You'll be fine. So that's a way to get this kind of practical kind of guidance on how to do it.
So next, I think it might be important to discuss maybe why it's difficult for officers to sometimes accomplish their goals, and maybe lead into some advice. I know that was something that Mike wanted to touch on.
I can start there from the police perspective if you'd like.
Perfect.
I think that there's a number of things, right? The police officers, a lot of times it is their identity, and sometimes it's so much their identity that like cops 24/7, right? So everything I do has to do with being a cop, and I'm working all the overtime, and I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and then they'll have their one or two things that they're doing, they think, for their wellness. But I think a lot of times that it's tough for officers, to do certain things or to seek out certain help when they really need it, because I know there's a lot of very good proactive departments that are there for their cops, right? But there still is a stigma with mental health issues, or if I just was involved in some type of incident, we'll do the debriefing and things like that. But I think cops are afraid, hey, if I go to my department, if I go to somebody and say I need help, then that's going to make me look weak. And unfortunately, that's still here today. I know a lot of agencies that are really working hard on that, but there's something in the mentality of cops that, I'm tough and I'm a cop and I should be able to deal with this. And what made me realize this is I've trained, tens of thousands of recruits over the years, and I know more cops than that, is that when all of this stuff started happening with COVID and the social unrest and everything, and I knew they were a good department, a proactive department, a department that cared, but maybe that department cared, but they didn't know the things that they needed to know to actually help them. So, or make them feel comfortable coming forward. And so I had numerous officers, dozens, 2 or 3 a week, call and say, they're comfortable talking to me, Mike, I just need somebody to talk to. This is how I'm feeling. This is what's going on. My 18-year-old son is in college now, and I feel like they're becoming anti-police and not respecting my job, and that hurts the family, or just all of this negativity that's come on, and they just need to talk to somebody. And a lot of them I can, talk to, and they feel better, and convince them to seek out the help that they need. But there still is that stigma. I don't need the help. I can handle it. I'm tough.
And
That's really some. Oh, go ahead, Constantine.
And I was going to say, this kind of being tough and not being weak, it's actually our own trap. And I'm saying our own trap for our police colleagues, actually, to get more and more deeper into a situation that becomes more complicated. I had a conversation with one of my officers that I see in the practice recently, and he was like, am I weak? I say, hold on a second. You have some reactions, right? I say, yes. How many critical incidents have you been exposed to in your career? He says, over the last 30 years, maybe more than 250 fatal death related. And I say, okay, listen to that now. You have been exposed to more than 300 death related incidents, and compare that number to an average civilian. An average civilian maybe has 1 or 2 max death-related incidents exposure, if so, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking about this kind of huge number that you're exposed to, and at the same time you call yourself weak. Right. I would say that you're very resilient, and as a human being, there is so much you can sustain. And then he tells me, he says, you know what? I never thought about that before.
A lot of this stems from not just police officers, but all of us being raised without understanding what emotions are even. And so learning about that, and we do cover that in the book too, but really focusing on, in order to understand that emotions are just emotions, and whatever emotion it is, and whatever level of intensity it has nothing to do with good or bad or weak or strong. It is what it is. It makes you a human being. The problem is that we're not raised to be able to know what to do with those unwanted emotions or those very intense emotions. And so the concept is how most of us are raised, and many cops, and especially men, little boys, are often raised to not embrace those negative emotions that are just really not negative. They're just unwanted, and especially the intense ones. So officers learn strategies to not deal with those emotions because they don't know about them, or they don't know what to do with them. They don't know how to cope with them and adequately release them, and embrace them, release them, understand them. So it becomes an easy fallback. I think as Konstantinos was saying, it's kind of like own it, that wait a second, some of this is not really about organizations, but a lot of it is and has been because police leaders, like the rest of us, had that mindset too. And that's really one of the things that hopefully we'll have time to talk about today, which is the importance of organizations developing a culture of wellness and ethics from the top down, and what that it really entails. But we can get to that hopefully in a little while.
Yeah. Just to kind of add to that, if I could, I think when we're talking about that kind of, the masculine cop, right? I mean, mostly if males, but also females. I'm a cop. I can't show my emotions. I can handle this. I can take this. But I find that there's a lot of recruit officers, especially when I first started wellness teaching in the academy when I first joined. And one of the things that I thought was so important were things like mindfulness, meditation, imagery, these different types of exercises that can lower the stress hormones in your body and lower your heart rate and get you grounded. And they kind of think it's this, oh, fluffy, I'm doing yoga thing or something, and I it's like, no, really, there's pro athletes that are using these things, but there was something about, and I'm just, you know what I mean? So it was, what I did initially was, so when I started teaching that, I just kind of changed the word for these tough cops. And I said, this is what we call combat breathing. And we know now this is used in the military, right? So I called it combat breathing, and you go over the proof of it based on the empirical research, and then they start practicing it, and that's the better way to sell it to them. So this I'm a tough cop is not just that I can't talk about it to somebody and I have to hold it in. It's also some of these things just seem, I don't know, not manly enough. But I really think we're making progress in that.
Right, absolutely. So the other sort of piece of this, obviously, is this idea of moral risks. So I'm wondering whether we can define what that is, and then maybe you can tell me how this sort of plays into sort of eroding officers' commitment to the good police work that they do.
Well, I think there's been this, as Konstantinos said, about looking at compassion fatigue and realizing that there wasn't a lot written about compassion fatigue in law enforcement. Well, what we also found is that there wasn't really a lot written about moral risks in policing. The literature on moral distress came often, most commonly from medical settings, where nurses and primarily nurses and even doctors were struggling with the idea of not being able to save everybody. And so there's been a lot more research on that. There was also a lot of research from the military on moral injury, but we know that moral injury is a phenomenon in law enforcement that is very much broader than often written about in the military. There are a lot of things in moral that officers will do or not do through no fault of their own, and things that don't involve violence or involve trauma that can cause a moral injury. A moral injury, in a nutshell, is something that the officer does or doesn't do that is viewed as a transgression of his or her values. And also seeing something done by a colleague or a supervisor that creates a sense of betrayal, like they see a supervisor or a colleague violating their values. And so the reality is that we're all ethical people. We have ethics. Whether we engage in ethical behavior or not is a separate issue. So the values that an officer has are often compromised in policing, not being able to do enough, not being able to help enough, not being able to see justice being done because of the criminal justice system and the limitations of what officers are able to accomplish, and also sometimes through no fault of their own, doing something or not doing something, failing to do something that they experience as a moral transgression. So part of this, another component that really came out in that research of mine that I mentioned before, is the phenomenon that Albert Bandura talked about, moral disengagement. And he specifically wrote about this theory of moral disengagement from the standpoint of explaining how can people mistreat other people. And it was rooted in wars, kind of his examination of how can people do atrocities to other people. But we looked at this from the standpoint of policing and normal routine aspects of policing that really cause officers to experience many of the mechanisms of moral disengagement. For example, dehumanization. That stems from creating an us versus them mentality, that the them are less than us, and that, according to Bandura and the theory, makes it easier for the people to mistreat a them. So this speaks to, again, there's all of these risks, which we really don't have time to talk about today, but we do have solutions to these risks. We have ways to combat this. Mike's got this beautiful model of tactical empathy and tactical respect that really is at the heart of trying to eliminate some of this through community-oriented policing techniques. And I'll let him talk about that, because the moral risks, I mean, we could spend we teach a whole class on the moral risks of policing, but what we want to be focusing on really primarily is, we know that they're out there. What are some specific steps that we can take to try to avoid officers experiencing the negative effects of those risks?
It's interesting what Dan said. At some point, I had a conversation with a colleague who's been practicing for 30 so years. So she was telling me that at some point in the early 90s, she was seeing an officer in the private practice. And she was like, he seemed to have some reactions, but didn't seem to be PTSD. But I was wondering what kind of reactions were those. So at some point he says, when I first saw your articles, I realized that, hey, you know what? Those are moral risks and moral reactions following the incident that he was exposed to. So it wasn't like PTSD, but it was more likely what we call moral injury and distress. So those kind of things that are distinct, at the same time, they can be very much intertwined with all these kind of other conditions that we talked about.
Yeah, and when I'm talking about tactical respect and tactical empathy, first and foremost, I would prefer that officers have true respect and true empathy, right? To be able to understand that, we're getting called to the scene when things are their worst. Doesn't make everybody a bad person. Everybody has financial problems, relationship problems, drug problems, alcohol, everything. And so when we are treated badly, when we get there, and it sounds like it's personal to us, it's not really personal to us. They're really just angry at the situation or angry at themselves. And if we don't, if we could realize that and not take it personal, and then also display that respect and display that empathy, even if I'm being yelled at or cussed at. I think that's one portion of the big picture. And I think the other thing, as far as gaining the trust of the community and becoming part of the community and getting that job satisfaction, is police officers need to make more non-enforcement contacts, right? It's not a traffic stop, it's not a domestic, it's not a call for service, but it's just getting out of your squad car, seeing somebody at somewhere, interacting with people, just so that they can get to know me as Mike person. I can get to know them as a person, and they realize maybe that, hey, I'm still a regular guy. I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I have a family, I'm a, Cubs fan and a Bears fan. We just get to know each other as people. And I think that those non-enforcement contacts go a long way. And it really, kind of, when you're working in your community and get to know them, then it takes the stress down and makes you feel pretty good about your job.
Right. So we've sort of already been talking about it, but I just wanted to maybe open up the floor to, strategies and advice that you would give to the individual, and then we'll sort of move on the way to organizations and sort of creating this this framework within organizations for wellness. So maybe let's start with the individual, if you want to maybe speak a little bit more to that.
I can start with a little bit about as far as the physical health and nutrition. And really, if you think about it, it's in a lot of these domains. What I have found is that, also being a personal trainer and a police officer, and just, we all know this, right? It's like, I am going to work out 2 hours every day from now on, and whether it's a New Year's resolution and I'm just going to keep doing it. And then if I can't do it for that full 2 hours, then I'm just not going to do it, right? And then it's sort of fades away. But if we realize that doing something is better than nothing, I may have a day where I'm working in the office and we have a gym here and I have a lot of Zoom meetings. I may go down, I have a 15-minute break, and I may do some sort of a exercise, maybe another exercise a little bit later. I did something that day, which still benefits me, but it keeps me from just dropping off. And as far as nutrition, if you read through what we have on nutrition, it doesn't mean that you have to eat perfect all the time. And I'm only going to have fruits and these vegetables and these whole grains. And no, you're going to eat the best you can. You're going to eat healthy foods. But you know what? If I want to have a pizza with every single thing on it once in a while, it doesn't make me, doesn't blow it, right? So it's like, even though 2 or 3 days, I go to my mom's and she makes her meatloaf and mashed potatoes and scalloped corn, and I'm going to eat all that, and it's okay. But it's just kind of a lifetime that I have to worry about, not just all in. And we just get people that are just, if I can't do it all this way, then it just fades away. But there's just little strategies you can do, for fitness and for nutrition, on duty and off duty, whether it's making sure you're packing your own lunch to take some healthy things, getting out of your squad car and walking. And a lot of officers carry bands now to do different exercises once in a while, just to get out of the car. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but it's kind of that, I've seen it happen so often. It's like, well, I'm getting ready, starting next month or starting tomorrow, but if they don't stick with that 2 hours, they're just, I'm done.
Do either of the other two want to add, either Dan or Konstantinos, maybe add something, strategies, advice, maybe on the mental health side, or you could also jump in on the physical stuff if you have anything.
Well, I think we talked a little about the emotions, and that's a process. And Mike mentioned really quickly, and I just want to kind of highlight and underline from the social standpoint of wellness, is that it's very easy in law enforcement to have your social circle narrow, shrink, and we really emphasize balance and wellness coming from maintaining friends outside of law enforcement and maintaining friends, with who maybe from childhood or earlier. And there's some challenges with that, because not everyone has a really super positive view of the police at this point. So it becomes very easy to circle the wagon socially and only hang out with other cops. And even that is okay. For example, I work with a lot of officers who have moved to Southern California from somewhere else. They are not from here. They move here. The larger agencies are hiring all the time, and they get hired and they don't know anyone else. They have no relatives here. Their literal only social circle are the people who were in their academy class with them, and then the people who are on shift with them. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you get together and you do social things, whether it's a softball league or going camping or doing whatever you do, you just got to turn off the cop talk. You have to find a way to have balance and realize that your life at some point, hopefully, you're going to retire, and you don't want and this becomes part of the emotional, the cognitive, the social, and the spiritual. Really, you don't want your identity to be rooted in the badge, because someday you're going to retire, and at least around here they poke a hole in the badge, and then they mount it for you so you can put it on a shelf somewhere. And if that's your identity, you may not have a very fulfilling retirement life. So creating the balance socially early on is a way to help prolong your health even long after the job is over.
Right. Anything else to add, Konstantinos?
Well, I was going to say first, like Dan mentioned, that wellness is we need to see that from a holistic perspective, like we describe in our power manual, which actually it's the cognitive, the emotional, the spiritual, social, physical. I'm not sure if I forget any other piece of it, and the social as well. So it needs to be throughout all these kind of different perspectives and aspects. So it's not just one thing or the other, or one dimension. So if you want to promote wellness, it needs to be multidimensional. So that's one thing. The other thing is, by doing that, you promote actually being more preventative. So you help yourself, instead of trying to be reactive, be more proactive. So trying to maintain a wellness kind of lifestyle that can actually prevent you from different kinds of consequences or any kind of negative impact that may have a more kind of in-depth kind of impact on you if you don't do anything about it. So that gives this kind of holistic perspective of wellness can give a better kind of shield on how to help you to move on in life. And the other thing I was going to say that even if that happens and you have some kind of reactions, we're human beings, it's always okay to ask for help. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with it. I mean, we're all human beings and we have reactions and ups and downs.
I think that what Mike's mentioned about, how athletes, not just pro athletes, but any athlete who focuses on performance enhancement, and it's the same thing. And when we talk about maximizing the health of an officer, we're really talking about that. We're talking about doing what you can do to maintain your optimal level of functioning all the time. And that requires a commitment to being able to learn mental strategies. So when we talk about resilience, we're talking about strategies to be able to cope with adversity. We're talking about eating properly. I mean, Olympic athletes train for years. They have a cheat day here and there, but they know that in order to operate at their peak, they have to be prepared, in all of these different areas. And they have to train for performing in less than optimal circumstances, because not every day is going to be 72 degrees Fahrenheit, sunny, with a nice cool breeze. They're going to have to compete at their peak level, even in bad conditions. The same thing occurs in law enforcement. So when we're talking about the bad conditions in law enforcement, we're talking about the exposure to traumas. We're talking about issues with a supervisor who may not be the most friendly or sensitive. It's learning to adapt to circumstances that are not ideal, and not have those circumstances derail your optimal level of functioning.
Right, absolutely. And then I guess sort of one of the last pieces that I wanted to talk about was sort of this this idea of it becoming a part of the organizational framework and sort of maintaining this culture of wellness. So maybe we can speak on that more broadly, and then get into sort of the various components of that.
I mean, the fundamentally, and this is where, you know, we mentioned this also, you know, that even if we're talking to recruits, even if we're talking to new officers, we're talking from the framework that some of you will someday be police leaders. You will be the ones who are promoting. So even if you're not in a position of leadership right now, learning these things and understanding what it means to have a culture of wellness and ethics, you may be in a position at some point to affect that. But so much of police wellness does, unfortunately, revolve around working in an organization. This is true for everything, by the way. Any job that you go to, any job that you have, the organization can help you look forward to going to work, or it can contribute to you kind of looking for another place to work, or being stuck and feeling stuck and just kind of going through the motions. And that's really what burnout is involved with. When in an organization, you have the sense of not only powerlessness, but not being heard, not being appreciated. And when we talk about burnout, that's really dealing with the organizational issues. The operational stuff that is stressful, that's where all the moral risks and the emotional issues come from. But there's a fundamental, and a lot of people are hearing about this more now. Trauma-informed systems help people, and if you, as a police leader, looked at your organization and said, I want this system to be trauma-informed. You know, it's hard enough for my employees out on the street dealing with the issues in the community, to then feel like they're being mistreated within the organization just adds to the problem, and it adds to impediments to wellness. So taking a trauma-informed approach has to be fundamental, not only in training officers to have trauma-informed responses to the people who they deal with in the public, and that gets to what Mike was talking about with the tactical respect and tactical empathy, to understand that someone is having a bad day, and how do we treat someone who has been experiencing trauma, but within the organization, understanding. And this has to do, we focus on everything from recruiting and hiring, to training, to supervision, to promotional practices, to compassionate discipline, and changing the nature of how an organization disciplines. So being trauma-informed, I think, is the beginning to starting to establish a culture of wellness and ethics, and understanding that people make mistakes. We can discipline someone for the behavior, but we can still be supportive of the individual. We can still be compassionate, even if they do something that ultimately results in the termination, because there's no way around that in some cases. But that doesn't mean we have to turn our back on that person. So trauma-informed, I think, creating organizations that are trauma-informed systems is the most important to be able to deal with the potential detrimental effects of exposure to trauma. In regard to that, there's a variety of techniques that probably are outside the time frame that we have here, but even things like developing restorative justice practices, you know, within an organization for disciplinary purposes, instead of disciplining always, to be able to recognize that some things aren't that serious, and let's find a way to not alienate or stigmatize the offender. Just like what the criminal justice systems have been doing with certain offenders, let's start adopting some of those practices within the organization as well. That keeps people happy, it keeps people healthier, it shows more of the commitment to individual wellness from the organizational perspective. I think there's also issues associated with every organization should develop a wellness unit and have dedicated sworn officers committed to focusing on wellness. But you can't just do that and then hire people who are be problem employees because they have such rough backgrounds, and you're throwing them to the wolves by hiring them and not providing them with adequate services. So there's a lot of those kinds of techniques.
Even considering following what Dan said about the organizational level of wellness, I think the other integral piece is how you deliver this kind of services. In other words, do you present a number of PowerPoint slides and you present it as wellness and resilience, or you try to make it in a more kind of practical, tangible way, providing services, having groups, having professionals around? How do you do that? How do you deliver this kind of service? That's another piece I think that it's also important. Not just being a couple of hours in the lecture program, but something more tangible and more efficient for officers' wellness and resilience.
Something that I hear from the coppers out on the street that I talk to, it's like, why is it that every time I do something wrong, I get disciplined, but every time I do something really good, they just tell me, well, that's your job, right? So, I mean, it's just, and then you get to where you have those officers, what we call magnetic squad cars, and they'll just sit there and talk to each other and complain about everything until they get a call, right? And, kind of get that negative cynicism thing going. But, sometimes just, I remember I was still on probation, and the biggest, scariest lieutenant we had on the department, I didn't even want to walk by his office. He called me to his office one day and he said, "Mike, get in here." And I said, "Yes, sir." I walked in and he said, "I just wanted to let you know you're doing a good job." Whew. And that meant so much to me, because this guy was started in the 60s and he was old school, but for him to tell me that I'm doing a good job, that I was fired up for quite a long time about that. Simple things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I know we sort of spoke on the various topics kind of broadly, but I'm wondering whether we can maybe provide some sort of tangible examples or strategies to how to sort of implement this, for example, within recruitment and hiring or training. And then I'm also wondering whether we can expand a little bit on this idea of restorative justice and what that would actually look like within services.
Well, I'll start with that one first, but when we talk about wellness and a culture of wellness and ethics, you have two avenues. You have to focus on prevention, and then you do have to focus on intervention. And so very briefly on the intervention is really, we've talked about the idea of, and this goes back to sports analogy, but not every offense by an officer that leads to discipline is the same. And we've encouraged organizations to develop kind of the hockey penalty model, so that you have certain things result in a 2-minute minor. You can have a double minor. You can have a 5-minute major. You can have a game misconduct. I mean, there's a variety of types of punishments. And so in progressive discipline, it's the same thing, but we're saying that, for example, in soccer, a yellow card, it's a yellow card. Okay, it's a yellow card. The person's still playing, and it's kind of like a little warning. It's a different mindset. It's taking the mindset that people are going to make mistakes, and if you have a more supportive, trauma-informed approach to intervention when it comes to misconduct, it's going to be focusing on ways to keep the person healthy and functioning and as a valuable member of the organization. The other component of intervention, obviously, and Konstantinos can talk about this more, would be creating, as he said, having peer support and having access to professionals that are just part of the organization, so there's no stigma when reaching out to talk to someone when you're having some struggles. But the other side of this is prevention, and prevention, it starts from the very beginning in terms of who you recruit. Even the organization doing an analysis that not every police officer working in every single type of organization should be the same kind of person. I mean, you need to have certain job dimensions met, but you have to recruit people who are going to be a good fit for your organization. And the hiring process should indoctrinate people to what it's going to be like working here and expose them to the reality of what it's going to be like working here. Not come work for us because we're just the greatest organization on the planet. Then they're going to show up and they're going to go, wait a second, they sold me a lemon. So this, it talks about revamping the whole idea of recruiting and hiring. And then training. Mike can talk about the training in terms of how do you change the nature of training to be more, how do you train recruits to be the kind of officer that you want on the street? That's a huge part of this in terms of prevention, as opposed to training them to be the kind of person who feels fine that if you're going to be an authority, you're going to yell and scream and be confrontational.
Yeah. Do we have time? Would you like me to address the?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So there's lots of different styles and philosophies of academies, and there's still a lot of very paramilitary academies. We base our training on the adult learning model. We treat every recruit with respect. I talk to them like I would want them to talk to people on the street. I'm not going to be up in their face like a boot camp, yelling and screaming at them for 14 weeks and then yell at them, now go out there and be nice to people. Oh, okay, right? So their stress they get is within our scenario-based training. And we have scenarios beginning after the second week, and we provide scenarios, 84 hours of scenarios where they're practicing their communication skills, their de-escalation skills, really emphasizing the community policing. And so I just think that, there's this big divide in police. Is it guardian? Is it warrior, right? Well, we don't want them to have a warrior mentality, meaning we don't want them to go out there and just like, I'm ready for something bad to happen. And I'm, I'm in the military. That's boot camp is necessary for that. But unfortunately, some people think that the guardian mentality means that I don't have fighting prowess. I'm not shooting my gun. I don't have the control tactics. And if you think I'm a guardian and I'm there to protect you, there's going to be times when I'm going to have to use my physical skills. But there's so much of the job where I'm simply interacting with people. I'm part of my community. And so those are all the things that we emphasize. And our scenarios start out fairly simple to begin with, and they just gradually build into more complicated and higher risk. We have scenarios involving interactions with people with mental health issues. We have scenarios involving where recruits have to intervene when there's an officer's using excessive force. And all of these things we've been doing, pre Ferguson. So I just think how you train, and we're also a trauma-informed academy. I find out early on that a lot of our recruit officers have had some serious trauma from childhood or sexual assault and things like that. And we want to be, cognitive of that. And we want to be able to get them through the training and help them develop those coping skills and be the, but we get a lot of good young people, and I tell them, you are the future. And I know things are bad now, but I feel so good about them. It's not going to be tomorrow, here in the United States, but you have in your career, you could make a difference. You can gain that trust. You can get out of your car and talk to people. And so that's kind of our overall philosophy. There's obviously a lot more to it than that, but I think it's important how academies train our new recruit officers, and that's part of police reform.
And part of that is that no person is perfect. And so the idea of trying to hire a perfect person is just not going to happen. And in fact, many people who have had those adverse experiences early on could become the most competent, most successful police officers, because they have developed some resilience. They have handled adversity, but it needs to be done in a trauma-informed way in an organization that is supportive and recognizes their value.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Well, I think we're sort of running out of time here. Do you guys have any sort of final thoughts before we close? Anything else you want to add?
Konstantinos is the best at wrapping things up.
Well, I was kind of ambivalent whether to say it or not, but let me tell you, whenever people ask me about the power manual, they say, What do you think about the manual? I say, to be honest with you, as I went through the last version of it, and we went through that as we were doing the edits, it seems to be like it was a great piece of artwork. And it's a piece of artwork based on science, but it's a piece of artwork. It's like you literally read or kind of, see this kind of Da Vinci paintings, where you see all these kind of different versions and different perspectives and everything. So it reminded me of this kind of nice piece of artwork. So I think it's going to add a lot of knowledge and discussion and contribution to law enforcement for the years to come.
And I would just like to add to my brothers and sisters out there in law enforcement, be well and stay safe.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining us today. For those of you interested in ordering their book, it's called The Power Manual, a step-by-step guide to improving police officer wellness, ethics, resilience. It is available for pre-order on Amazon now, and the link is in the description of this session.